Oh, I love having everything printed.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate everybody coming out to this panel discussion on good things out of Nazareth. I have the privilege, or have had the privilege of editing these letters. It seems like well, it has been many years. I never thought these letters would see the light of day. I thought I would talk a little bit. I'm Dr. Alexander. I thought I would talk a little bit about my background and how these letters came into being. And then we have some very fine panelists who have labored through the text and read some of these letters. I first became aware of O'Connor. I'm going to be talking a little bit from an interview I did. I got an online interview, and they submitted some really interesting questions. And one of the first questions was, how did I come to know O'Connor? Well, I was privileged in the late 60s when the campuses were radicalized due to the Vietnam War. I'm giving away my age a little bit here. The recent Vietnam War, let me say. Only, 40 or 50 years ago. But I had the privilege of hearing and studying O'Connor with one of her teachers who had taught her at the University of Iowa. And this was Andrew Lytle, who edited the Swanee Review, and I was a kind of bewildered moviegoer in the late 60s, to quote Walker Percy, kind of wandering around, wondering what I was going to do with myself. And I heard Lytle read her stories. And Lytle had been a graduate of the Yale School of Drama, and he had taught O'Connor at Iowa. And his classroom performance of her stories was life-altering. So I will always remember that in the fall of 1969, when he came in and began reading A Good Man Is Hard to Find, of course, and did The Misfit. Like I said, this is better than television. I said, I got to find out more about this. And then that January, I came back to campus, and in his inimitable voice, he says, "Son, you wrote a brilliant exam." And I said, "Oh, okay." He says, "You got to come out and have some bourbon with me." So he had an ancestral home out at Monteagle, Tennessee, and you would go out there at noon, and he would serve you. This was kind of the politically incorrect days. He would serve a student bourbon and silver goblets, and you would be out there till 3 o'clock and wonder how you were going to get back to class, the 8 miles, or get back to campus, maybe to your bed. So he was serving. He would have students out. He'd have students out at night. So anyway, he was a really one of the great classroom teachers. He used to come to Samla and sign his books. He was here in 92. He died in 96. He was here in 92, and he was down at the book table with always his little cup, and you knew what the cup had. He did behave himself, though. He was very genteel. So that's how I began to become interested in O'Connor. And then I went to grad school at the University of Dallas, and some of the other people who had been in the Vanderbilt orbit were there, the students of the original agrarians. In fact, some people at Dallas then called it Nashville West. But I became aware of and acquainted with Carolyn Gordon, who figures very heavily in this book. Now, she was extremely intimidating, and I would never sign up for her course. I was very, sort of intimidated by her. She would come to the elevator with a cane, if you can imagine, and the people around the elevator would part like Moses in the Red Sea. And she would put this cane out in like the elevator out here and hit the button. And this is the way she got on the elevator. She was an extremely opinionated but very brilliant teacher of writing. And I discussed with her, I did not take her courses, I discussed with her some of O'Connor's stories. She was married to Alan Tate, the poet, the author of Ode to the Confederate Dead. And Mr. Tate, I have a rather, how should I say, colorful footnote about him in the book. Mr. Tate, when I was 19 years old, had us do a exegesis at the University of the South, and he handed me back a C-, which was pretty devastating. And it was a poem that I thought I'd written a decent, analysis of an Auden poem. And I said, Mr. Tate, can you tell me what's wrong with it? He says, well, what's obvious to me is not obvious to you. And he puffed on his Franklin Roosevelt cigarette. That was the end of it. I mean, he didn't tell me why I got a C-. So long story short, he was not a very endearing classroom teacher. But his wife, they eventually were divorced at the University of Dallas. Carolyn Gordon was an ardent disciple of Flannery O'Connor. So my grad work was read a lot of O'Connor, and then in 1979, of course, The Habit of Being sort of changed everything. The letters that came out, edited by Sally Fitzgerald, and with that, my mother and I began to talk a lot about Flannery O'Connor. Now, up until '79, she was convinced that I had lost my mind to be reading about stories with murders on the side of the road, gorings, hangings in the attic, the typical pleasant things that you find in an O'Connor story. And she said, I won't read these letters. She was kind of a Victorian lady. I won't read these stories. But when The Habit of Being came out, she said, I understand why you like her now. So we spent many long conversations over the holidays back in the early 80s, talking about The Habit of Being. She loved it. She loved some of the stories, particularly my mother ran a farm, and she really identified with the rural life that the O'Connor family led. And so shortly after that, when I was teaching, I had heard in the early 90s that there were other letters that did not make the cut but were just as good from The Habit of Being, and I heard that they were at various places. So one of the things that I recount in my introduction to this book, several years ago, I made my way to the Duke University archives, and I actually found the letters between Flannery O'Connor and Father McCown. And so there's a lot of letters between Father McCown and his Jesuit friends, and a good thing out of Nazareth. And I have a chapter dedicated to him called the first priest who said turkey dog to me. That's O'Connor's quote. And what's amazing about McCown, as I recount in this book, is he says, I'm not an intellectual Jesuit, but I ended up becoming friends with the two of the leading writers of mid-century, Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy. And he knocked on their doors and visited with them and struck up friendships with them. So I found the letters between him and Flannery O'Connor, and then that led me to other Jesuits, and then sort of the orbit of other people began to appear, and so the book kind of took on a life of its own. One of the things I want to talk about, though, since we are in Atlanta, is there's a prominent figure both in The Habit of Being and in this book in one of the chapters, and that's this native Atlantan, Betty Hester, who is known as A in The Habit of Being. And one of the questions I was asked in this online interview, Hester still remains quite a bit a mystery. She died very tragically here in Atlanta. But I rate the correspondence between Elizabeth Hester and Flannery O'Connor as equitable